Our next speaker is Sikandra Kurdi. Sikandra is Associate Research Fellow in the Development Strategy and Governance Division at IFPRI, and she is based in our Cairo office. Sikandra was the lead researcher for the impact evaluation. So Sikandra, I'm very happy and looking forward to your presentation.
Okay, so thank you everyone for coming, and thanks for all the helpful introductions, especially for Dan Gilligan, who has already given a bit of the motivation here. So conflict is now a major driver of food insecurity globally, and we're interested in the impacts of cash transfers in conflict situations in particular, because it's becoming an increasingly popular mode of humanitarian aid delivery. Cash transfers tend to be less expensive and preferred by beneficiaries, and there's some suggestive evidence that they may be more beneficial for nutrition than in-kind food aid, because they tend to be associated with greater dietary diversity. However, there's a lack of rigorous evidence for this because of the difficulty of conducting research in humanitarian settings. So the impact evaluation that I'm presenting today was originally designed before the current conflict started. Back, as Lemise had mentioned, this was originally a pilot program in 3 districts in El Hodeida. And at the time, we were able to randomize among second priority beneficiaries in the project. The randomization happened at the village level, and what we're going to be doing is comparing the treatment group, who are households who received cash conditional on attending the nutritional education sessions, which you saw about in the video, with households in other villages that still had those nutritional educational sessions going on, but the households that were choosing in the control villages were not eligible for the program during the pilot program phase. So the main difference between the 2 types of households is receiving the conditional cash transfers, even though even for the control households, they had some access to these community health educators because they were active in their communities. The randomization that we did to set up this evaluation before the conflict continued by inertia during the program resumption. You can see the timeline here. So we had the pilot intervention after the baseline started, then it was paused for almost a year, and then started up again as part of the emergency crisis response program. Also, just to mention in terms of the actual estimates, these are going to be based on self-reported treatment status, because the treatment assignment, even though it was mostly respected, it wasn't perfect. There was a number of households in the control communities that ended up getting some cash transfers. So we're going to be reporting IV estimates with treatment assignment as instrumental variable. I'm going to give you now just the main highlights for the results. If you're interested in the full analysis, that's available in the published working paper, as Olivia had mentioned. The primary results we're looking at is first consumption and then dietary diversity. So we're able to see that a large share of the cash transfers were used for increased household food purchases. If you're comparing, these impact estimates are all comparing treatment to control and controlling for household characteristics. We see that households increased their overall consumption of food, and particularly that increase was coming from non-staple foods. So there wasn't actually a change in consumption of staple calories, but households were consuming more milk, eggs, and fruits and vegetables. And those impacts on non-staple food consumption were particularly strong in the poorest tercile of households in this, that were targeted by the program. As a result, both of this increased spending on important complementary foods, as well as this important component of the nutritional education, which talked about complementary food and the reason that young children need to be receiving not just staple foods, but also animal source proteins. We think both of these contributed to the fact that we do find in this impact evaluation significant impacts on first dietary diversity. So it's about an increase of 0.8 food groups per day, compared to 4 being the minimally acceptable diet for children at the age of complementary feeding. And then that's also going to be followed up by increases in anthropometrics. Oh, I'm going back the wrong way, sir. Okay, so we have the increases in consumption. We also have improved practices. So the nutritional education sessions looked at complementary feeding. They also emphasize early initiation of breastfeeding and exclusive breastfeeding. Both of those, in terms of self-reported practices, increased dramatically in treatment compared to the control group, as well as the rate of treatment for water. And as a result of this combination of better nutritional practices and better access to food at the household level, we see significant increases in nutritional outcomes for children. We have first the decreased rate of children under 5 being diagnosed with malnutrition at a health center. So as I mentioned, the comparison we're making here is between households receiving cash transfers and those not receiving cash transfers. Everyone had access to the same things you saw in the video in terms of better support with reaching the health centers, but the households that are receiving the cash transfers and motivated to attend the training sessions have much lower rates of diagnosed malnutrition, both moderate and severe malnutrition. And we also, for the poorest households, for the poorest tertile of households, we see significant improvements in anthropometric outcomes. 0.43 in weight for age Z-scores, which is a measure of short-term nutritional deficiency, and 0.35 for height for age Z-scores, which is a measure of long-term nutritional deficiency. And these are pretty relatively large impacts. Again, it's particularly for the poorest tertile of households, and it's for the children that were measured at both baseline and follow-up. So these are children that were at the age of complementary feeding throughout the life of the program, and they are the children that we would expect to have the strongest impacts on. In addition to these results on household food consumption and nutritional practices, the cash transfers also allowed households to make non-food purchases without drawing down their assets. So that's going to allow them to be more resilient to coping with future shocks. We found that there was a significant decrease in the share of households that reported coping with shocks by selling gold or borrowing from neighbors. And you can see in the graph here that while most households are self-reporting that they spent the transfers on food, it's also common for them to spend on healthcare and repaying debt. Finally, I mentioned that we're comparing households that received cash conditional on the training sessions to households that weren't receiving that cash, but everybody actually had access to the training sessions. We found actually a fairly substantial share of households in our sample, even those that were not receiving the cash transfers, still said that they either attended the training sessions, or even if they didn't attend the training sessions, they said that they learned something from the community health educator, maybe indirectly or maybe through a conversation that wasn't officially part of the training sessions. It was actually 13% of control households that attended the sessions and 26% that still reported learning something new. So we see this as kind of pretty substantial spillover impacts, and this is both kind of a positive finding for the program as a whole, and it means that some of our impact results might actually be underestimated because even our control households are partially benefiting from these kind of informational interventions, even though they're not getting the cash. That's suggested by the fact that we see significant increases between baseline and ex post in some of our behavioral outcomes. So the knowledge about the health center location, iron-rich food for preventing anemia and exclusive breastfeeding, as well as some of the practices related to water treatment are increasing even in the controlled households.